So, one of the interesting things about running 5e is that I'm going with a city campaign. Since it's a city campaign, the characters have to see things from the idea of a city dweller. No more than murder hobos, although they might become that, but they have to consider their actions in the context of what it means to live in an actual city, or at least a fantasy city. Now, the city I'm using right now is Waterdeep, so I've got a lot of the Waterdeep information that's available online as my baseline. I'm going to modify that, of course, but it does have the feeling, at least the way it's written, that it's kind of a city. It's really more of a dungeon masquerading as a city. And that makes sense for having adventures. Doesn't necessarily make sense for a real city based on, I guess, non-adventurers. So I'm scaling back a lot of the stuff and kind of tweaking the weird stuff that I do find. Now, with that said, I do find something kind of interesting when it comes down to evaluating the ways things would work in a fantasy medieval or high Roman society. The last thing I came across was the idea of banking. Now, as it turns out, they've managed to get their hands on a stack of gems worth a fair amount of money. Probably, well, okay, the numbers we're using say an average kind of middle class wages are going to be a gold piece a day. And so they have come into $3,000, 3,000 gold pieces. So that's like 8 years' wages for an individual. Now they're splitting it up amongst the party, so there's actually 6 people. But even so, it opens the questions like, well, people aren't going to have like a pile of gold pieces like that. So how do you set up your safekeeping for that level of wealth? It's kind of weird level of wealth because it's not really enough to own property. At least I don't think it would be. And I'm going to have to go and do some research into what the value of property was in the past. But my sense is this isn't what would be getting, well, it seems to me that you could get property for a couple of years' wages. So if they were to spend it all on, say, the equivalent of a house or someplace outside of the city, they could own real estate. But when you're talking about, it's like 500 gold pieces each. Yeah, 500 gold pieces each. You could have a little treasure chest full of 500 gold pieces. Ooh. And where do you keep your treasure chest? In my room. How secure is the room? You know, all these questions start to come up, and I was like, well, okay, how does that work? Still not sure on the answer. With that said, at the moment I'm using a system of banking, and I'm thinking of upgrading that. So they've gotten banknotes, which are probably only usable, well, certainly going to be usable in their city of those banks. Got to figure out which other cities have branches of the bank, and what happens, how that's going to be, I guess, tracked. Now, one thing I'm thinking about is to have a magic item that the bank will give you that's an identifier. So you would be able to show the bank, the banker or the bank, or some other branch of the bank, your ID card, and using that you would be able to access your funds, which, you know, the more I think about it, I think I kind of like that. Now that means it's up to the bank to be able to safeguard your funds, or, you know, have funds available. But that's pretty much what goes on in the real world anyways. There's not going to be an insurance system. I've got to figure out where the banks keep gold, money, and what other assets they have, which is a whole weird banking thing. I don't know how banking really worked in medieval times. Apparently, what I was reading is when I was like looking up for like the Medicis, banks, because of usury, which is not going to be a problem for the fantasy world, because of usury, banks would have late fees, and when they loan money out, if you pay your money on time, they wouldn't loan you money again. So basically, you're essentially forced to pay your late fees, which doubled or filled in for the lack of interest, which was kind of an interesting point. Now, I don't expect the characters to be borrowing money yet, but you tend to borrow money when you have other collateral. Now, as they start getting wealthier, they're going to have to decide how they're going to keep their money and essentially invest it, which, for the most part, in previous games, it was basically a game of you get your loot, you upgrade your treasure, you upgrade your magic items, lather, rinse, repeat. And I had a money sink that was set up for people to essentially burn money to get experience points so you could become more powerful by being rich, which I still kind of like, but I'm not sure how I'm going to do that with the current economic model, or the one gold piece, what that transfer rate will be for an experience point for a gold piece, or as I had for the other one in 3.5, I was using one experience point for 50 gold pieces, I think. And I'm also thinking I'll probably tier that up, ramp it up. The higher level you get, the more expensive it is to go up levels. So you can kind of expect merchants or wealthy people to have a certain level of intrinsic level power. But the banking thing comes to, since 3.5 has a system that's about basically limiting the number of magic items you can carry, although it doesn't extend to consumables. But the number of magic items you can carry has to do with being attuned, and the base number in 5 is 4 magic items. And I was thinking that the banking ID should be a magic item that has to be attuned, which would then lead to adventuring types having squires who are their banker, who you'd have to trust, which is kind of interesting. I don't know how that would work. What would the mechanism be for getting a new card or new ID, that sort of thing? What kind of hoops you would have to go through for that, or if you're just screwed. And then, of course, what happens if the bank has a run or gets screwed? It's pretty much the same thing. It's like, well, why would you bury your treasure? Because you don't trust the banks. And I was kind of thinking about that. And so I'm going to have to set up a little bit of background about the banking, since I'm going to make that a thing for the current 5.0 campaign. Anyways, I'm at 9 minutes, so I was just kind of rambling and seeing how this worked. And I'm going to cut it here.